Now, our influential series, The First 1,000 Days, A Legacy for Life. Dr. Mark Porter investigates how events in early life can have a surprising long-term impact on future adult health. This week, in the last part of the series, he asks if these risk factors for disease acquired in early life can be passed on to future generations.
You're not just the product of your DNA and you're not just the product of your environment, but in fact the environment can influence how your DNA works.
The genes that the baby inherits, they can be changed by the mother's diet during pregnancy. Now, those changes in the genes can actually be carried on from generation to generation.
Most people don't realize that the way they're making their body will have a huge impact on their children and their children's children. I think this transgenerational effect is virtually unknown to people in the population.
The first 1,000 days of a child's life, from the moment of conception through pregnancy up until their second birthday, is a crucial period in determining how healthy that child will be as an adult. But many of our building blocks are formed even earlier than that, at least 100 years earlier for a middle-aged chap like me. Imagine if your risk of developing problems like heart disease and diabetes as an adult was partly determined by the environment in which your grandparents lived, what they ate, smoked and drank, or how much stress they were under. I think we all understand how such environmental factors can impact on health here and now, but the concept that your lifestyle could have a direct effect on the well-being of your as yet unborn children and grandchildren is an alien one. Yet there's a dawning realization among experts across the world that such a link almost certainly exists. Perhaps this week's programme should be called The First 100 Years, A Legacy for Life.
My name's Kaylee, I'm 21 and I'm now pregnant myself.
My name's Lorraine and I'm Kaylee's mum.
I'm Valerie, I'm Kaylee's nan. Going back to sort of 44 years ago, they never said, oh, this was bad for the baby, or that was bad for the baby, or it's bad for you. You just ate what you wanted. You didn't know that it could have affected, like my daughter, my granddaughter, my great-granddaughter. You didn't know that it could affect any of that.
But it's quite scary. It can affect you, and then me, and then my baby, though.
Yeah, it is.
And you don't know that,
no,
do you?
Don't, no.
One of the earliest studies to identify a link between environmental conditions and the impact on the health of future generations followed the relatives of people living in northern Sweden in the early 19th century, where there were repeated crop failures interspersed with bumper harvests. Researchers monitoring the health of the relatives of those 19th century Swedes turned up something unusual. There was a significant difference in the longevity of the grandchildren depending on whether their grandparents had been exposed to feast or famine.
My name is Olle Bygren. I'm a senior professor at Karolinska Institute in Stockholm. We looked at parents and grandparents in a small community in the north, and grandchildren then, how they were influenced by the grandparents' nutrition during their early life.
Was it a surprise to you that the effects of deprivation, of starvation, could be passed from not just to one generation but to the grandchildren as well?
Yeah, it was against rules actually, because one cannot inherit things one have picked up during life. It was said always.
But just because something's always said doesn't make it true. So what could be behind the transgenerational impact seen in the Swedish study? Anne Ferguson-Smith is Professor of Developmental Genetics at the University of Cambridge.
The debate has gone on for many years. People said, oh, well, it's all in your genes, and people have said, oh, no, it's in your environment, and we've never really known how much is contributed by these two factors. Well, more recently, it's been recognised that, in fact, there is this other element, that, in fact, the environment talks to the DNA, talks to your genes. So it's not just nature or nurture, it's the relationship between the environment and your genetic makeup. That in fact, how our genetic makeup functions can depend on signals from the environment that can control the function of our DNA.
So it's not a nature or nurture, it's the fact that actually what we're coming to learn more and more is that this is a circle.
That's
where
right.
your genes influence your environment, influence how you behave in your environment, and your environment influences your genes, and so on, round and round it goes. And it's wrong to artificially divide them into two separate camps. They're both exerting influences.
That's right. The way the environment talks to the DNA is through this placing what I think of really as molecular flags that sit on the DNA and tell the DNA how to work, tell which genes to be on and which genes to be off. And you can imagine that the environment might influence the ability of those flags to do that. They might fall off or new ones might come on. These molecular flags are called epigenetic modifications. And these are normal molecular flags. This is a normal process.
So the practical applications of that are what?
That has good effects and bad effects. So, for example, your environment, such as smoking or your diet, if that's communicating with your DNA and telling your genes how to function, that can have a negative effect. Alternatively, of course, if you alter your behaviour and change your lifestyle, that can have positive outcomes as to how your genes work.
Genes are not Stalinist dictators. They don't just do things. What they do is conditioned by experience, and they have to be turned on.
David Barker is Professor of Clinical Epidemiology at the University of Southampton and the man behind the Barker theory, which links the quality of nutrition in the womb to the risk of developing diseases like diabetes, heart attack and stroke later in life.
It's the nutrients that come from the mother that turn on the baby's genes or not. And it's not just the nutrients, it's other influences like oxygen, but the core of it is the flow of nutrients, moulds the baby, turns on the genes or not, and that sets the baby for the rest of its life.
If nutritional flow is low, many of those genes will be modified, even though the genes themselves are perfectly normal. They will be turned off and on in a way we call epigenetics.
Professor Kent Thornburg is director of the Heart Research Center at the Oregon Health and Science University in America.
This epigenetic effect will actually make the baby vulnerable for disease and the child more likely to have difficulties as they grow up, because when people are nutrition deprived, they tend to develop diseases later in their life. Their genes have been modified by the environment in which they grew.
And what sort of environment creates harmful modifications? What sort of factors are we talking about?
Well, there are three that are the most powerful and quite a few other minor ones. Those are low nutrition or high nutrition. The second one is what we call maternal stress. When the mother is stressed through any number of means, it might be abused by a spouse or being worried about not having enough money to buy food and things like that, these social stresses. And the third one is low oxygen. Oftentimes, there is nutritional stress and social stress that go together. So you get a double effect, which means that the baby will be vulnerable not only for heart disease, but also osteoporosis and obesity and what we call the metabolic syndrome, which will make it a very high risk that those babies will have these very expensive medical problems later in their life.
So this has profound implications if you're a parent or a would-be parent, that actually the nutritional flow that you pass on while your baby's growing inside you in the womb and thereafter will actually affect their chances of having disease maybe decades later.
Yes, and what's even more profound is the fact, especially for girls and somewhat for boys, they will pass that on to the next generation too. So their vulnerability will be passed on, and it will take generations of good nutrition to reverse the heritable change that is passed from a mother to her child.
Those changes set the way in which that baby's body will behave, and therefore how it will respond to risks from the environment, challenges from the environment, smoking, infection, poverty, stress, deprivation.
Alan Jackson is Professor of Human Nutrition and has a special interest in how food and nutrients enable developing babies and children to grow normally.
So that the social environment can act through a nutritional signal at the level of the young baby to set the genes of that child, which it then passes on from generation to generation.
My house as a future grandmother, that it could be going to Kaylee's baby is quite surprising to me. I've never really thought about that, because you think that it's all connected to the genes of the father and the mother rather than distant relatives. So that's really interesting. I didn't know that could be potentially affecting the new generation.
It's always been thought that when a new child is conceived by the joining of an egg and sperm, the epigenetic markers that may have appeared on his or her parents' genes are deleted. But enticing though this fresh start sounds, things are not quite that simple.
Two things are happening. First of all, the slate is being wiped clean, and then new marks, new molecular flags are being put on. And so it's really generally thought that any abnormal molecular flags should disappear from one generation to the next. Now, as we study this more deeply, we're learning that there's two places where this can go wrong. It's possible that in a compromised environment, such as not eating enough when you're pregnant, the slate can't properly get wiped clean. So it's mostly wiped clean, but maybe a few of these molecular flags are inappropriately left behind. Alternatively, or in addition, in a compromised environment, the new marks may not be put on properly. They may not be put on in the right place. There might not be enough of them, and that's a second opportunity for something to go wrong. So perhaps some of these molecular flags aren't wiped clean, and they can actually stick around.
The epigenetic marks are traditionally believed to be totally wiped clean, erased, and then re-established to bring about development. There's some evidence that maybe some of this reprogramming isn't 100%.
Jonathan Mill is Senior Lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry, King's College London, and has a special interest in gene-environment interplay in conditions like schizophrenia.
We do a lot of work looking at genetically identical twins, one of whom maybe has a disease such as schizophrenia and the other one who doesn't. We know there the risk isn't genetic, and we can look to see where they maybe differ epigenetically and maybe understand maybe how a different environmental exposure early on in their life has led them to become discordant for disease later in life.
The fact that these stressful events during early childhood can change the way that genes are read or expressed by the body suggests that there may be a possibility that this could be inherited. Do we have any evidence that this spreads on to the next generation, the children of these people?
So this is a kind of really controversial notion in the field at the moment. There is some epidemiological evidence that some transgenerational effects may be occurring. There's some very preliminary evidence from animal studies that, for instance, drug exposure or altered diet in one generation could have a change in gene expression that alters
appearance or behaviour or whatever.
Exactly. But actually, the empirical evidence for this being transmitted across the germline is still very preliminary.
Not least because of the timescale involved. Animal studies are easier because they reproduce and mature so quickly, but it takes many decades to follow similar transgenerational effects in humans. John Holloway is a geneticist at the University of Southampton.
These studies are very difficult to do in humans because you need to be able to assess carefully the environment of someone during pregnancy and also be able to look at the outcomes in old age of their grandchildren. So really, to understand whether these are relevant or not, we can use animals as a model. And we know that changing the diet of pregnant animals can cause changes similar to what we've seen in humans, and we know that these can be passed through more than one generation. So, for example, we know that changing the diet of pregnant rats leads to changes in lung function in their offspring. And what we're working on now is to see whether that passes down to another generation.
I don't want to preempt your own findings, but if that was to be the case, what mechanism would you use to explain that? How is that information being passed on?
If the effects go through to the great-grandchildren, then that effect has to be mediated by epigenetic effects, by these chemical changes to the DNA. We know that these chemical effects change the way genes are expressed, and they can be passed from one generation to the other. So in a study now we have in the Isle of Wight, we're looking at women with and without asthma, and we're trying to see whether those patterns pass on to their children.
Good afternoon once again, ladies and gentlemen. We're shortly arriving in the cows. In the interest of your comfort and safety.
On the Isle of Wight, researchers have been looking